95% of Africa's significant cultural heritage is outside of the continent, and most of it was taken during the era of colonization.
Battlefield spoils, booty, loot, plunder, call it what you like. But every nation did it.
There wasn't equal balance of power, and it wasn't simply that objects were taken during conflict, but they were taken in a very violent and forceful way.
Do we want museums to be temples of truth? Or just provide a cheap therapy session for misguided post-colonial guilt?
This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. And today we are going to argue a question that connects art with power, with history, with law, and with a sense of justice. So, you know when you go to a museum, and next to every work of art, every artifact you look at, there's a little placard that gives you the details of what it is you're looking at, where it came from, when it was created, maybe who the artist was. In some cases, though, there is also a raging controversy that the little placard does not spell out for you. I am talking about artifacts that a conquering power took from their places of origin, basically as loot, as prizes of war. The most obvious example, the one that gets most talked about, is the vast collection of bronzes that the British Army seized in 1897 from the Kingdom of Benin in Western Africa. These works of art now, and there are thousands of them, now reside in public museums and university collections and in private hands across Britain and Germany and France and the Netherlands and the US and more than 20 other countries. The controversy, the claim that this stuff belongs back in Africa. The same argument is being made about a set of nearly 2,500-year-old sculptures that were taken from Athens and have been on display in the British Museum in London since the 1800s, though that is not as the outcome of war in that particular case. But still, Greece wants them back, and Britain is saying no, arguing that there are good reasons to keep them on public display in London, not sending them back to Greece. There are many other such examples, and in this, we see the makings of a worthwhile debate. So we're doing it with four debaters, 2 against 2, taking opposite sides on this question. Should museums repatriate cultural artifacts? So let's meet our debaters. First, arguing that the answer to that question is yes. And again, the question is, should museums repatriate cultural artifacts? I want to welcome Chika Okeke-Agulu. Chika is an artist and a curator, as well as a professor of art, archaeology, and African American studies at Princeton, and the director of Princeton's Africa World Initiative. Chika, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
Chika, just a little personal note. You studied art at the University of Nigeria, and I'm just curious, what did studying there teach you that an art school in, say, London or New York could not have?
That's a tough question, but I think one key element to this is that back in art school at the University of Nigeria, we were taught that there's a deep connection between aesthetics and ethics. And this is based on the principles of Igbo art of southeastern Nigeria. Now, if I studied in Europe or in the United States, I would have missed that connection, given that ethics and aesthetics are thought to be different domains of philosophy.
Okay, very interesting point. So now I want to introduce your partner in the debate, and that is Leila Amineddoleh, who is an art and cultural heritage lawyer. Leila, welcome to the program. So we note that you were on the debate team in high school. We're curious, what's one thing from back then that you still catch yourself doing as a lawyer today?
One thing to always do, whether you're a high school student, college student, or a practicing lawyer, is to always be prepared. Know your subject matter and fight zealously.
We love a debater who prepares for a debate, so thank you. It's great to have you on the program. Now, arguing the opposite side, arguing against repatriation, at least broad repatriation, I want to welcome first Dominic Selwood, who is an historian, a barrister, and a best-selling author, currently working actually on a new account of the British Museum, which I think we're going to be talking about. Dominic, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
And you've been debating this topic now for more than a decade, including a debate you did with Chika in 2022. What do you remember most from that debate?
Well, it was lovely to meet Chika, and I really enjoyed it. It was a high-profile debate, and I'm just always keen when this subject is discussed, because I think it's got real increasing urgency.
And it's also one that people care about and can connect to. So thank you for joining us. And now I want to finally welcome your partner, Mario Trabucco della Torretta. Mario, you are a classical archaeologist. Welcome to the program. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
And I want to point out that you and Dominic recently teamed up in a debate to argue for keeping the Elgin marbles in London. Those are the ones that I referred to that were taken from Athens. You won that debate by presumably vote of the audience. I'm wondering how you're feeling about your odds today.
Well, I feel pretty positive, just as I felt the other times, because whenever you have the ability to give equal representation to both points of view, actually you see that we get the upper hand because people are persuaded by facts.
All right. So I like the attitude all of you are bringing to this debate. I think it's going to be a rich one and an enlightening one. And I'd like at this point to move on to our opening statements. We want to give each of you 2 minutes to explain why you are arguing yes or no on the question of repatriation. Leila, you are up first and you are arguing yes, museums should repatriate cultural artifacts. The floor is yours to tell us why.
Thank you. Museums should repatriate looted cultural artifacts for 2 reasons: the law and ethics. Heritage laws developed in response to the race to loot, when powerful European nations led the hunt for valuable artifacts to fill newly established museums. Contemporaneously, wealthy collectors enjoying the grand tour built private collections to create personal legacies. In response, nations passed laws to stop the removal of their treasures. It's no surprise that Italy, Greece, and Egypt were the first countries to pass these cultural regulations. Patrimony laws create national ownership for objects classified as cultural heritage that are found within a country's borders after the passage of that law. These legal tools empower nations and their cultural ministries to protect and manage heritage, avoid the loss and destruction of important artifacts, and prevent treasure hunters from robbing humanity of its history. Today, most nations have these laws, and they're recognized and enforced by other countries. However, museums have long benefited from buying and receiving items removed in contravention of international laws. While there is value in universal or encyclopedic museums that care for and display art from around the world, that value does not trump the law or the ethical considerations that warrant the return of plundered, or in some case, forcefully removed heritage. Supporters of universal museums often bemoan repatriations, arguing that returning cultural objects would open the floodgates and lead to the demise of the world's leading museums. But that is simply not true. Nations that have suffered from plunder and theft do not seek to recover all works housed in museums. In many cases, returning legal title of loot opens doors to collaborative relationships, long-term loans, and scholarly exchange, while signaling a change in ethics and modern collecting practices, emphasizing that heritage should not be looted, but guarded for all of humanity.
Thank you very much, Leila. So, Dominic, you're from the other side. You disagree. You believe museums should not be repatriating cultural artifacts. Here's your 2 minutes to make your case, please.
Thank you very much. If I want to know about the culinary variety of Italy, I can go to an Italian deli and see a wondrous array of cheeses, salamis, oils, vegetables, wines. The store owner has meticulously selected them to showcase centuries of skill and artistry. And short of going to Italy, there really is nowhere else I can go for this experience. Museums are the same. If you want to show an alien from Mars what wonders have filled planet Earth, what amazing things the human race has created, you can only really do that in a museum. But you don't have to be an alien from Mars to appreciate a museum. They are unique places, and there are no alternatives. If you don't want museums, then the human past ends up out of sight, in private collections or in landfill. Take the British Museum. It holds many thousands of Stone Age tools and over 130,000 cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia. Scholars consult them every day. Museums are bank vaults of our shared past. They preserve the human story. It's specialist, expensive work, but it's priceless and unique. Museums are not places where we should manipulate the past. It's only since the second half of last century that we've started the fiction that objects have homes. They don't and never did. To give them a nationality and sense of belonging is Disneyfying them. It's nationalistic, saying this is ours and not yours, and we want to wrap it in our flag. Historically, that is nonsensical. Every people on every continent since the dawn of time have travelled with their objects, gifted them, exchanged them, and until the early 1900s have taken other people's with violence. Every single nation. Museums are humanity's scrapbooks and memory boxes. Who are we to interfere with that now for our own personal, ideological, professional, or financial reasons?
Thank you very much, Dominic. This brings it back now to you, Chika. Again, you are arguing on the yes side. You believe that repatriation should happen from museums. The floor is yours.
So as a young art and art history student at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, I had absolutely no first-hand encounter with some of the finest artistic heritages of Nigeria, including, for instance, the 400 years old Royal Benin art, and even the 19th and 20th century sculptures of my own Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria. Years after graduation in 1995, I had the wonderful luck of seeing these Benin Bronzes at the British Museum. It took many more years for me to see the Igbo sculptures that my own mother, who is 81, still mourns their loss. From my hometown in 1968, I had to see them at the Musée Quai Branly in Paris. Now, my education, therefore, was impaired because of the 1897 British soldiers' looting of the Oba's palace, carting away 5,000 plus objects, kept some for themselves, while the British government gifted about 1,000 of these works to the British Museum and sold off the rest to Western collectors. And during the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 70, European dealers sponsored looting raids of shrines in the Biafra zone, war zone in southeastern Nigeria. Many of them ended up where? The Paris Museum. So do these museums have any moral right to keep these stolen objects from my homeland? I bet they don't. And of course, the argument is that they are universal museums. And I guess the question is universal to whom? People like me who have no access to these museums because they are guarded by visa regimes, by nations that are keeping these objects from humanity, such as myself. I think there's something terribly wrong about this.
Thank you, Chika. And finally, we bring it to you, Mario. And once again, you are on the side arguing, along with Dominic, no, museums should not be repatriating cultural artifacts. Please tell us why.
So, we are being asked to bow at the altar of cultural justice. It's a lovely phrase, isn't it? Guaranteed to win you polite applause at a Washington dinner party or an Ivy League faculty lounge. But this factional concept rests on a fatal contradiction. It can only survive by negating the truth. And without truth, there can be no justice. True justice requires looking at the historical record exactly as it is. Cultural justice, on the other hand, demands historical amnesia. It asks us to retroactively criminalize the past, to infantilize the people of the past, negating their agency, and to pretend that handing over an ancient artifact to a modern bureaucracy magically heals the wounds of history. Against this tide of sentimental revisionism stands the institution of the museum itself. The party opposite will try to frame our museums as active crime scenes. But I remind you that a museum is fundamentally a place of truth. It exists to showcase the history of a people, both the glorious and the brutally uncomfortable. To do this, it relies on objective evidence, not modern emotion. To empty this institution piece by piece, it's not an act of liberation. It's actually cultural vandalism. What we are witnessing is an unholy alliance of 19th century nationalism, modern populism, and an overwhelming desire by Western elites to simply feel good about themselves at the expense of historical reality. So, what are we really asking ourselves here is, do we want museums to be temples of truth? Or just provide a cheap therapy session for misguided post-colonial guilt?
Thank you very much, Mario. I want to sum up what I think I heard as I listened and took notes on your opening arguments. So the side that's arguing, yes, the artifact should be repatriated, are saying that it's fundamentally a matter of law and ethics. They're just saying, look at what happened in history. Many of these items were taken from their places of origins, from, I think they would call it, from their homelands, in violation of morality and ethics, sometimes the law. They say that any other viewpoint comes down to the case that might makes right, which they reject. They also believe that fundamentally this argument revolves around a kind of original sin committed in the way these artifacts left their homes, their place of origin, let me say, and the only redemption is to return them to where they are. And they also say placing them in these artifacts in places like London, New York, puts them out of reach of those who live in the places where these artifacts actually came from. The side arguing no, not against repatriation, says it's a fiction that objects have homes, that it's really, this argument is a matter of modern day guilt trying to be assuaged by rewriting the past. They say there's an exonerating context to the story of where these places came from, the journey they took, that the laws were different or non-existent at the time they were taken. They have two philosophical points: that there's no national identity for any work of art, no passport, as they say, and that by being gathered together in these great museums, they serve a public good by being presented in company with other artifacts from around the world where they tell a story of the human race writ large. So there's a lot to get into on this one, and I want to start by taking it to you, Chika, the argument from your opponents. And Leila, you can join in on this one as well, because I'm bringing it from your opponent's side. The argument that the rules were different in the past. At the time a lot of these were taken, that the moral argument is that you're making is against sort of seizure in time of war for some of these artifacts, not all of them. It's an argument we hear often made in your opponent's argument is one that sort of echoes the discussion about reparations or taking down statues, that you're applying modern day laws and ethics and values to the past, and that's unfair. You shouldn't be doing that. Can you take that on first, Chika?
Sure. So the idea that the laws of the past are different from today's. One curious thing I find in the archives, from the British soldiers, is one postcard by one of the soldiers had at the back of the images of the stuff that they've looted from Benin, the word loot in quotes. That's one of the soldiers that looted Benin. So if that soldier thought that what they had were loots, I wonder when laws of looting were legal. The other part that I have to mention, as I started with, was the Igbo sculptures from southeastern Nigeria. These were taken in 1968 to 1970. There was a UNESCO 1954 convention that protected artifacts in zones of war. Now, I don't know if they're arguing now that those objects at the Musée Quai Branly in Paris somehow were legally taken in 1968. I don't know if that's the argument.
Let me take that to the other side. What I think I hear Chika saying is that some of the objects that are now in museums in the West and the North were taken much more recently than 150, 200 years ago, when already these laws were in place. So do you make a distinction between when objects were taken? I'll take that to you, Dominic.
Yes, absolutely. And let's take this step by step, right? So let's look at laws then, and let's look at laws now. So the laws in force then, and we're going back talking about the Benin Bronzes and other of the major collections from the 19th century. In those laws, there were things called military prize laws. In the UK, there was the Army Prize Money Act 1832. These laws set out specific systems for taking battlefield spoils, booty, loot, plunder, call it what you like. but every nation did it. In Nigeria, Chika, the Edo, the other people did it for many, many centuries. Lots of their wealth came also from plundering. That's what you did when you won in battle. Every single nation. The Bible is full of it. So the fact that we are not happy with it now, and I think we live in a better world without it, doesn't mean we can pretend that the laws were the same back then, because they weren't. And then in terms of the modern laws, Leila will correct me, but as far as I'm aware, there is not a single public international treaty or cultural norm that requires any museum, like the British Museum or the Smithsonian or the Louvre, to hand back their antiquities. What we have are a series of laws like the UNESCO 1970, which deals with cultural artifacts in peacetime, that deal with not stealing, not illicitly trafficking items taken after the treaty came into force in 1970. So I think we all agree the world is becoming a better place and better legally regulated, but there is nothing legally that applies to things that were taken in the 1820s or 1890s.
Leila?
So I'd like to clarify a few things, that that laws protecting heritage actually date back centuries. Well, one thing that Dominic stated that I take umbrage with is that every nation did it. I think, first off, I don't think that's justification for taking property. And when the British went in and removed objects from Benin, there were already laws on the books that examined ownership. But we can't turn a blind eye to the fact that the Kingdom of Benin did not have equal power in protecting its property. There wasn't equal balance of power, and it wasn't simply that objects were taken during conflict, but they were taken in a very violent and forceful way, where people were killed, where people had limbs cut off as the British soldiers were going into a punitive expedition and removing property. And that context is incredibly important in determining how objects were taken. Was it ethical? Was it legal? Or was it in a form of violence that we're perpetuating by displaying them?
Well, you just phrased the question the way I was going to put it to Mario. So Mario, can you please respond to that?
Yes, so I think one thing Leila just said is extremely important. That is, context is everything. We cannot think that whenever in 1834 the Greek law went into force, then every other nation immediately were growing a cultural heritage conscience and abiding by the same rule. Actually, the Greeks were not even the first. The first was actually the Vatican state, the Papal state. The first heritage protection law is the so-called Editto Pacca of 1802, I think it was. And it's actually the second iteration of a previous one, the edict by Cardinal Doria Pamphili of the year before. So there were, in places and in certain contexts, there was a little bit of this growing conscience about heritage. But it doesn't happen at the same rate, at the same time everywhere. So we need to have the contextual element. Whenever we, for example, hear the soldier was labeling the photograph saying loot, yes, that's what it was called. But this doesn't mean that it was illegal. This doesn't mean that the word loot was used in the same way and with the same negative connotation as we use it nowadays in 2026, with all the legal bits and pieces that have brought us to have now these so developed heritage conscience. So, after distinguishing these, then obviously what we need to do is also think about the moral aspect, which I find extremely interesting. Morally, one is behaving correctly if he is abiding by the law. So if the law back then was allowing armed forces to take loot, what it was called back then obviously soldiers that were abiding by those laws were behaving lawfully and therefore in a morally justifiable way.
Okay, I see where we all disagree on that, and I don't think further discussion is going to you're not going to persuade the other side. So I want to move on to another piece of the argument that I heard. And I want to bring this to you, Chika. Your opponents say an artifact may have a place of origin, but that doesn't mean that it belongs to that place, that it has a home there, that things don't have homes. It's a powerful statement to be made, and I'd like to see what your response is to it.
So the cultural heritages of Europe, do they have homes?
Let me stop you right there and take that very focused question to Dominic.
No, they don't have homes. It's a complete fantasy. And it's relatively recent in the history of the world. Nobody ever said in the past that objects have homes. Most objects in your home and my home don't have homes wherever they're made. But we seem to have created this sui generis category for antiquities to say they do have homes. It's neither legally nor morally normal.
Okay, I want to bring it back to Chika, having heard how you respond to that.
Yeah, so if they don't have homes, why did the government of England and Britain in 1963, just as African countries were gaining their independence, enact the British Museum Act of 1963 after 18 African countries won their independence? Why was that law placed, if not to protect the stuff that they had collected, looted from the African continent, to create a home for them in England, and then guard them with these visa regimes that make it impossible for Africans and many in the global south to have access to these cultural heritages? And you sit here and tell me that they don't have homes when they are homed and kept at the British Museum for folks who can travel to England and the British Museum. I just don't get it.
Before you respond, Dominic, I want to see, Leila, do you have like a 1-2 punch from your side on that one? Something to add?
Well, for me, it's surprising to say that objects don't have homes, because some of these objects that were looted, had been in their homes for centuries, and their place of origin. And that context is so important, not just for archaeology, but really for our understanding of the objects and their purposes.
Okay, so from the other side now, we heard Chika make this case about the British, the government wanting to protect its heritage, and Leila saying it just seems natural that things belong to the place where they came from. I'd like to take that to the other side. We haven't heard from you in a moment, Mario, so can you start with that, please?
Yes, sure. Saying that objects are having a home is basically anthropomorphizing the object. It's basically giving the object a soul, which is something that is entirely impossible to do, because they are inanimated objects. Some of the objects, actually most of the objects that we see in our museums nowadays are basically rubbish, are things that have been discarded, and they were never intended to be in museums. They were never intended to be valued and looked at in the same way that we now do, and they are transformed by the fact of being excavated thousands of years later and then put in a museum under glass and looked at with such a forensic research methodology as the one that we exercise now. So we cannot say the context of provenance informs what we need to do with the object nowadays, because it's not the same object anymore. Once a ritual mask from Africa is brought to the British Museum, is no longer part of that particular context. And even if you bring back the Benin Bronzes to Benin, you are not recreating the Obas Palace that was razed to the ground in 1897. You are not putting them back on those wooden pillars. You are not recreating the context as it was. You may try to approximate in a museum reconstruction if you want, but you are basically doing something different with objects that have been completely morphed and changed.
All right, let's hear from your partner, Dominic, on this point.
So I think it's a really important issue to come back to what Chika raised. The British Museum Act 1963 is probably about the 10th British Museum Act. The first one was in 1753 when it was founded, and that was the moment when the Parliamentary Trust was created, which all these objects are held by. And that is what made them inalienable. That is what made it so the trustees cannot give them to anybody else. The British Museum Act in 63 changed who the trustees were, did a load of technical things. It did nothing about changing the status of the objects. And then the second point is that, Europeans have heritage too. In Britain, Codex Amiatinus is the oldest Latin Vulgate Bible in the world, which is a really important document. It powered most of the scholarship of the Middle Ages in Europe. That Bible has been in Florence for over 1,000 years. Am I happy for it to be there? Yes, of course I am. It's an ambassador for the culture of early medieval England. It talks about the community of scholarship that existed in the church in Europe at that time. I see no point in bringing it back to England so that we can wrap it in a Union flag and say this is ours. This is part of the story of the development of Europe, as are the Benin Bronzes part of the story not only of Edo, Nigeria, but also of interactions with colonial powers.
John, may I respond to something that Dominic just stated?
Actually, from this point, I want to say you can all just talk to each other. You don't need my permission to talk, so go for it.
Oh, fantastic.
So I love the example that you give, Dominic, of this book, this volume being an ambassador. And that is something that's really important, to have objects serve as ambassadors and to share heritage universally and around the world. However, I think that misses the point. We're not talking about one object serving as ambassador, but we're talking about countries that have experienced extensive loss and don't have those objects available to them at all, not just one-off objects serving as ambassadors. And I think that also gets to one of the points. Maybe there's a misconstruction in the understanding of this, of how I think we're looking at this debate, but I don't think countries are asking for most of the objects back from museums. We're talking about select objects that are symbolic and important for countries. We're not asking for all objects to be removed or returned home or to their origins.
And I might add to that.
I think even
let me just add to that before you respond, please, Dominic. I think there's something strange about the recommendation being made by Mario about what Benin might be able to do with its bronzes and brasses should they be returned. I don't know that you're in a position to determine or advise, except if they solicited, what they might do with the brasses that some of which are returning from Germany, 1,100 of them returning from Germany. They will determine how they want to display or use them, whether they want to return them to some of the events and festivals within their societies. That's left to them. The other point also is that actually the idea that laws were made and they are legal when the people who, it's almost like the 1885 balkanization or division of the African continent, where European powers gathered together and decided the fate of the entire continent without a single representation. And so when we cite these laws made by the powerful and the wealthy against the subjected peoples as though these are universal laws, I really don't get it.
Well, I can come back on that if you'd like, please, Chika. So there are Nigerian historians who speak about why do we only ever talk about the British Empire and we don't talk about the Edo Empire? Why do we not talk about how the Edo Empire became wealthy in the first place, able to make the brasses and have the affluence to do that? Right? This is not a world in which it's a binary of good versus evil. This is a world in which there are complex histories.
Sure.
And in terms of what happens with the bronzes, seems we're focusing on them, there's a really interesting practical question about restitution. It's all very well to talk in the abstract sense about, well, things should go back to their home, which I wouldn't agree with anyway. But if you do accept that, how do you operate it? Who makes those decisions? So in Benin at the moment, there are probably, at least to my knowledge, at least 150 bronzes. But nobody can decide whether the Federal Republic of Nigeria, the region of Edo, or the Oba in Benin gets to keep them or display them. So when the new Museum of West African Art opened last November, not a single Benin bronze is on display. And that currently is still the position. So I'm not saying that that's a reason not to give them back, but I am saying restitution is a complex question. And to simply approach it from a moral standpoint that it's the ethical thing to do, it needs a lot of practical working out as well.
We saw I'm sorry, go ahead. You go.
I was going to talk about the fact that you're absolutely correct, Dominic, that restitutions are complex. And as a lawyer working in this area and involved in repatriations, I understand that and I agree to that point. However, there are also so many wonderful benefits that can be created through collaboration. So long-term loans that benefit everyone, use the expertise of people within their origin country and people within these institutions like the British Museum, that it's not a zero-sum game. Returning an object isn't a loss from a museum, but an opportunity to have access to loans, to expertise, to archaeological digs, to international relationships, to educating the public. And these are all positive things by working together to repatriate not all of the objects, but select objects. I think that's a really positive thing that should be celebrated, to allow objects to return to their homes. And I know you don't really like that framing, but to go to their homes. Some of these objects are significant to people, are used for ceremonial practices, have other significance when they're returned to their origins. And I think we can celebrate that and kind of, what we say in the law, expand the pie so that everyone can do well, returning objects to help local communities as well as the international community and the museum world.
Mario, do you seriously fear the dissolution of the modern universal style museum in the West, in the great cities, with this process? Do you really think it could go that far?
If we decide that every Greek object has a right to be replaced into its original context, then I don't see why we need to do this for the Elgin marbles, but we cannot do that for a sarcophagus from Clazomene or a coin from any of the Greek cities that ended up for many other reasons into the British Museum centuries and millennia later. So it's a matter of principle. The other thing that I want to point out, talking about principles, is that I get it. It's an opportunity. Sometimes, definitely, we have museums collaborating together, and there is a nice flow of skills and knowledge that goes from one side to another, usually uplifting one of the source countries in a way, because they get to learn more how things are done in Europe and in the US, and that's definitely fantastic. But it's fantastic so long as it is voluntary. Whenever you have this collaboration and it's coming in good faith, not with a demand where we have one party that is actually trying to push forward a battle of reivindication, talking about historical wrongs that are more imaginary than anything else, and then everything descends from there. And then you have the Western institution most of the time that has to basically fight a PR battle and basically get into a position where they are always defending themselves and they need to do something to look good. Otherwise,
let me jump in. Let me jump in on the look good point, because you said something quite provocative in your opening that I want to bring to Chika, which is that this movement to repatriate, you kind of described it as the something that's being driven by liberal guilt or progressive guilt to feel good. Chika, what about that argument? And I'd like to hear from you on it also, Leila.
Yeah, we've heard similar arguments about whether reckoning with slavery is a matter of guilt trip. So really, I think the question for me is that by the account of Benedict Savoy and Felwine Sarr, 95% of Africa's significant cultural heritage is outside of the continent, and most of it was taken during the era of colonization. And so if we are really talking about a future that might be a global future, there's no way we can move forward with that without reckoning with that past. So I think that for us to think about a possible future, it cannot be on the basis of we're not returning anything, but we can somehow negotiate a relationship of exchange. How is that going to happen?
I think there are a plurality of views on this, though, because Nelson Mandela, for example, came to the British Museum in 2000 when the new Africa galleries opened. And he'd said he'd heard about the British Museum from when he was a small boy, and he'd always dreamed of coming there. And there he was in the Africa galleries. You can read the speech online. He speaks about how they filled him with incredible pride that Africa's contribution to amazing art, amazing culture, amazing word civilization is being shown there for everybody to see among all of the other cultures and civilizations. And he said it's his hope that it's this kind of bringing together of culture that ultimately leads to peace between people, because it's a unifying act.
That's great for Mandela. I need to because that's great for Mandela. I wonder what my 81-year-old mother would say about the Igbo sculptures and ritual objects and figures that are the Cape Bronze that she would never be able to visit, as Mandela did to London. So we're talking about a vast section of humanity that do not and cannot have access to the Great British Museum and all the objects that it's hoarding.
Well, Dominic, I'd like to also respond to you in that I agree that seeing objects in these international museums do give people a sense of pride and help to share other cultures. And I think that's wonderful for humanity. But I think we have to look at the context in which objects were taken and also look at the numbers of objects. You don't need 1,000 objects from a culture, half of which, or maybe 90% of which, are in storage. These universal encyclopedic museums have most of their holdings in storage. People don't actually see the objects. They don't have access to them, but rather they're kind of kept as prizes in storage units until there's a rotating exhibit. So yes, you can have those objects and feel pride in seeing them and share them with the world, but the number of kind of trophies you have in museums isn't really justified, and they could be returned and brought back to their homes so that people from those areas also have access to that wonderful art.
May I interject a bit on this museum point? There seems to be a little bit of confusion and uncertainty on how a museum works. Definitely, yes, a small portion of the holdings of a museum goes on display in the permanent exhibition. And that's obviously the objects that have more power to elicit a thirst for knowledge and to wonder and to be interesting for the wider general public. But then the museum is also a research institution, and whenever you are practicing research, then what you are doing is actually going to all of those objects in the warehouses that are pertaining to the same class. I myself, in the British Museum for my doctorate, was cataloging almost 2,000 attic weights that to a normal person would look almost non-distinguishable from each other, and yet I found a wealth of knowledge coming from comparing all of those. And if you go in the British Museum, you find only 3 of them of this particular class being displayed under glass and available to the general public. This doesn't mean that all the other 1900 are useless, or that all the other 1900s can be alienated by the museum, because what you're doing by doing that, you are undermining research. You are undermining the ability to carry out academic research and publishing.
I'm sorry, I have to break in. We are now going to bring in some other voices, some subject matter experts who have been listening to the debate, and they're going to join us with some questions. And first, I want to welcome Elizabeth Marlowe. Elizabeth is a professor of art and director of the Museum Studies program at Colgate. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us in the program. I know you've been listening, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what question you have for our debaters.
Thank you so much for having me. I do have a question for our debaters today. I would love to know if you make distinctions between the different types of objects. We've been speaking in really broad terms. You've been speaking in broad terms about kind of objects in general. In my view, it's important to differentiate among different categories of objects. So, for example, human remains, objects that are still under worship in their country of origin, objects that are unique and rare, such as the Parthenon sculptures. One category that hasn't been on the table in this discussion is Holocaust repatriations. We willingly return things to families who were dispossessed during the Holocaust because we know the precise family from whom something was plundered. I wonder if we would put the Benin royal family in that same category as well. And then finally, there was some interesting discussion earlier about whether or not objects have homes, and a suggestion that no, they don't. And I am wondering, Dominic, I'm admiring that lovely clock on the mantle behind your head that is visible to those of us who are seeing this on the screen. If objects don't have a home, are you suggesting that I can come to your home and simply expropriate that clock because it's a universal object? I think it would look even more important in my university museum here at Colgate. It's a universal object with significance to my students. So why should you get to have it?
Right, so what I mean by they don't have a home is that they don't have a place of origin, which is the only place they can be, or the place where we're under a moral compunction to return them. Clearly, at different moments, different people own things, but there's no natural, like the Germans would say, Heimat, a place where they really belong, and everywhere else is a sort of a false home, is what I'm trying to say. And in terms of difference of objects, I'll just speak very briefly about that. I think people can, human remains, that's a really great example. Many human remains are thousands of years old. There are no living people to whom they make sense in a family context. Many of them, they don't even make sense in a genetic context. And often you can't even sample the DNA. But so let's take the example. The British Museum has over 1,000 bodies from Sudan, right? They were given to them by the Sudanese government because the Sudanese government has no bioarchaeology preservation facilities. And the museum looks after them for Sudan because the government gave them to them. But yet somebody coming into a museum, if you put a microphone in front of them and said, do you think they should have 1,000 bodies from Sudan? People would probably be a bit horrified. But actually, it's about what Mario was talking about. It's about scholarship. And that's one of the reasons why they were given, because the museum charges scholars no fees to come and work on them. And they're doing extraordinary work with mapping cancer, coronary heart disease, all sorts of, this is a data set of humans that modern science doesn't have because they don't have modern pollution, modern junk food, modern alcohol, and so on. So, as with all of these topics, I think it's more complex than one often thinks.
I want to let, before we go on to the next part of Elizabeth's question, let Leila respond to, if you want to, Leila, to what was just said.
I think this goes back again to what we were saying earlier and what Elizabeth also mentioned in her question about countries not wanting everything back. So in this case, Sudan, the government of Sudan wants the objects at the British Museum, and that isn't something that Chika and I are arguing for, the return of objects that countries don't want. In fact, countries do want some of their objects on display in these larger museums. And as Elizabeth mentioned, countries aren't asking for everything back. In fact, I represent the Republic of Italy in litigations here. I've also represented the Republic of Greece. And in both of those situations, those countries have successfully recovered works from universal encyclopedic museums. However, they're not asking for everything back. And in fact, the structure that they've created in working with these large museums is a really positive one. For example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has long-term loans with Italy that have really added to scholarship and international exchange. Just this past year, Greece had granted Italy another long-term loan. So a different country, Greece, has done this, in which they're happy to work with the Met because the Met has the research facilities and the conservation facilities to work on these important objects. But the actual ownership, the title, is with Greece while the work is still on long-term loan at the Met, signaling that the return of title, the recognition that works were looted and should be repatriated, that's being made by both parties while still allowing these universal museums with expert conservation and technical processes to benefit and to help everyone observe and learn about these objects.
And Mario, Elizabeth also mentioned the case that I think probably in the minds of a lot of people listening, the return of art stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust by Germany and presumably Austria as well, as making it clear that there are certainly cases where the moral imperative to return something that was looted is really obvious. So how do you respond to that?
I think that most of the categories that Elizabeth mentioned in her question are already covered by laws. We have laws on human remains, we have laws on the return of Nazi loot, we have laws on many other of these categories. The problem I see is whenever we are talking about making restitutions that are forced onto museums and holding institutions because of a sort of moral compulsion, as Dominic was calling it before, and completely out of the framework of the existing law. For example, yes, definitely, Leila mentions the returns of the Euphronius crater or the Morgantina Venus, but those were actually looted, and looted demonstrably so after the entrance into force of the 1970 UNESCO Convention. Whenever we see something that has been performed illegally in terms of transfer of property from one place to another, definitely I'm the first one to say yes, they need to go back. But we are not talking about this whenever we are talking about the Rosetta Stone, whenever we are talking about the Elgin marbles, whenever we are talking about the Oakananaya, where we have clear historical evidence that they were acquired legitimately and in compliance with the law of the time. In that case, whenever you say yes, but they are symbolic, they were not born symbolic. This symbolic aspect is something that we are giving to them ex post facto. And what I want is for this to be recognized and to say that it's not right that whenever something has been legally acquired, then somebody comes in after a couple of decades or a couple of centuries and says, you know what, I have a symbolic claim to it. Can I have it back, please?
Elizabeth,
John, can I respond to one thing just about the
please.
Holocaust looted art? Because it's a little different than talking about antiquities, but I think there are a lot of parallels here. So museums and U.S. law has developed to address Holocaust looted art. And Mario, I would disagree with you, or I would bring out a detail that you mentioned in your discussion about works that were removed that was not illegal under the law. So what Holocaust looted art, what the Nazi Party did was actually try to legitimize these transfers and legitimize these takings. And the US law came in decades later and created this whole other way of looking at these transactions, showing that there was an imbalance of power. And because of that, these transactions need to be unwound because people weren't voluntarily giving their artworks over to the Nazis, but instead were being threatened, knew that there were consequences. And so case law developed to actually rectify that transfer. But we haven't seen the same with antiquities, and I think it's in part the way that we think about ownership, national ownership versus individual ownership. With Nazi looted art, we see the faces of families, we know the victims, we know the names of those people, and people think of national ownership in a very abstract way. But essentially, it's the same thing. If you have the right to own something, then you are that property owner. And if something was looted in under very violent circumstances, then there should be some rectification.
I think there's the question that Elizabeth asked about home. If objects don't have homes, what were inalienability laws about? If not to make the museums that hold them their homes, that you could not take them out of those spaces. The other point to make about research and the value of museums for research, absolutely. But what would you say, Dominic, or Mario, to that young me at the University of Nigeria and Nsukka that was studying art, that had no access to these same research resources that you enjoy in Italy or in London, precisely because much of that cultural heritage had been looted, whether 100 years ago or 60 years ago. They are stored in spaces where students like me, none of my 18 classmates at the University of Nigeria and Nsukka has ever had the opportunity to see, not to talk of researching, Igbo ritual sculpture of significance, because they are all in Europe.
Mario, I because of time, I need to ask you to try to answer this question in very tightly, and I know it's a big question.
Yes, no, definitely. What I think is what we really need to understand is that there are places that are naturally rich in culture. And there are places that have been instead becoming source countries that where this culture has been moved from one place to another. But these cannot be a reason to unwind history and then try to put everything back in a sort of a domino game where you move stuff from one side to the other. To the student that has the need to see Nigerian legally acquired and legitimately acquired material in London, I say let's give them a grant. Let's definitely empower that student to come to London and study all of that material. But that's not a reason to empty the British Museum and give every country the objects that were coming from that country originally.
Elizabeth, thank you for your question. It got us to some very interesting places in a hurry, so I really, really appreciate your joining the program. Thanks for joining us. Now I'd like to welcome in Graham Bowley. Graham is an investigative reporter who covers the world of culture for the New York Times. Graham, thanks for listening in, and we'd love to hear what you want to ask. Hi.
Great debate. Thank you very, very much. I'd like to clarify one thing. Mario said earlier on, and then I got a bit confused. We've been talking a lot about historical stuff. Very, very important. Colonial era. In truth, a lot of the things that are going back at the moment, the thousands and thousands of objects, are not from that era. They turned out to have been taken from countries in recent years, post-war. And they're going back now based on local criminal law. In New York, for example, penal law, these are seen as stolen objects. They're going back on that basis. I guess this is for Dominic and Mario. The stuff that's actually going back now based on New York law, for example, you embrace that and you accept that? Or are you saying that even that is overdone?
Yeah, so I think it's important to you're right, it is complex, right? So ultimately, in the legal world, you have international law and you have domestic law, right? And countries take responsibility for their own domestic law. So if a country legislates that all items that are connected with Holocaust looting go back, then they go back. That's fine. That's a country's domestic legislation, and it exists in the US, it exists in the UK. What we were talking about earlier in the program was antiquities. So that's not colonial era either, but these are when one state makes a claim against another state. And there are no laws before 1970 that allow any state to claim anything taken from another state. So you're right to make the distinction between the past and more recently, but equally you have to look at that distinction between domestic and international.
Can I just interrupt with one thing? I do want to draw out the fact that 1970 isn't always a cutoff. For example, Italy has a patrimony law that grants ownership into the country that predates 1970. So does Greece. So does...
And that's fine. And that's a domestic law. I'm trying to talk about a state claiming against another state.
No, but
there are no laws that do that.
Like that law in Italy has been recognized by other countries before 1970, and Italy has enforced that, and other countries have recognized that. So
right, but it doesn't impose obligations on other countries, right? No. But it doesn't impose obligations on other countries.
Under domestic law of other countries, they may recognize that ownership law. Not every country has, but many have.
There is no obligation, exactly. The 1939 Italy Cultural Heritage Law that you're referring to, yes, it has been complied to voluntarily in a way, or as a result of bilateral obligation entertained by one country and another. But this is not like an international convention like the UNESCO 1970, where everybody is voluntarily putting themselves forward and saying, yes, we do agree to abide to those principles. But anyway, say all of this is in a way less relevant, because if we are talking about legitimately acquired museum pieces, it's one thing. If we are talking about stuff that you can prove in court that has been illegitimately acquired, then another discipline apply, another set of rules, and another discussion is to be had. I don't think we can mix up very easily one to the with the other by using the same word for both of categories. For example, whenever you say loot 1897 or loot 1987, in a way reversing the numbers, it's not the same thing.
Yeah, Mario, I hear you. It still comes back to who makes the law for whose convenience. I think that we will always come back to this question, right? At various points in history, powerful nations made laws that were convenient to them. And I think what I'm hearing is we don't need to mess with those laws because powerful countries made those laws, legitimized their actions against subject peoples. And we just have to leave it at that. I think that's what I'm hearing.
No, I don't think we need to leave it at that, because there is a reason why those countries were empowered to behave that way and to enforce those laws.
Yeah, because they were imperial nations.
Reason is the jus gentium, is the international law that says that there is a right of conquest, and that whenever a country conquests another, has an undisposable right to the public property of that particular country. So you can do and make this argument.
In looking at what happened in Benin, let's go back to that example, and looking at like the international context, the context of that taking was the scramble for Africa to cut up that continent and provide that property and those resources, cultural resources, natural resources, to divide up the continent and provide it to European powers. And I don't think we should forget that context. But
look at the context historically. What we are talking about is European countries that have conquered the lands, and they were agreeing through bilateral or multilateral instruments of international law status the way they were disposing of these legitimately acquired in international law property.
But those nations were not...
We don't agree now, by looking from 2026 backwards, we don't agree now the way things were done.
Yeah, Mario, but it's not about now. I don't know that in 1897, the Edo people or the Ashanti people or the Dahomey people thought that what the Europeans did was okay. So it's not that we're looking at it now. Right, it was okay to the British
in international law.
I think the trying to create a hierarchy or a scale of moral right or wrong is really, really difficult historically, and I think we should be very careful of it. So, for example, there is a group of African Americans in the US who are telling museums in the US and Europe not to send the Benin Bronzes back to Benin because it would be rewarding the Oba's family twice for slavery, because a significant amount of the wealth of Benin was created by selling African slaves that they'd kidnapped and enslaved to European slave traders. So the bronzes were made using, many of them, the Manila brass that was used by Europeans to pay in the slave trade. And so these descendants of African Americans, and African Americans now, are saying, no, we're not rewarding the Oba's family twice for slave profiteering. So, the morality of these things is very complex. So I think just trying to paint it as Europeans bad, colonized countries good, is very, very difficult historically. There are complexities that need to be looked at as well.
Can I interrupt for one thing about painting Europeans as bad? Because I don't think that's our intention, and maybe the debate skewed that way, but I don't think that's our intention. So I think it's very laudable that countries like Germany have returned to objects and have these relationships with Nigeria. There's a wonderful museum in Hamburg in the north of Germany that has an incredible display that educates the public about how the objects were taken, displays the objects as loans. The title belongs to Nigeria, but the German museum is actually educating its public and protecting the objects and displaying them in a really valuable way. And I think that's really laudable. Same thing with the Smithsonian in the United States. The fact that the Smithsonian has returned objects not for legal agreements that were made in 1897, but based on ethics. And I don't think ethics should be left out of this debate. The law is always informed by ethics, and that's how our laws have changed over time. Just the way that ethics informed the debate over Nazi-looted art, and the law developed and created a mechanism for ethical returns, the same should be done with antiquities. As ethics and as norms change over time, the law must change with it.
Graham, I want to thank you for that question because you certainly stirred something up. Thank you very much for joining us in the program. We have about 1.5 minutes left before closing statements. I just want to bring in one question from somebody who's been watching live in our Substack audience. It's Lily. She asks, I'm going to take this to you, Chika. Is this necessarily a binary question, or is there a third option, offering compensation to the origin country for the stolen artifacts?
That's not a good third option. I think from what we've been saying throughout the program is that we need to rethink how we deal with the past. We need to rethink institutions that were established in an age of vastly unequal power relations. And one way to do that, a model, as my colleague Leila has just mentioned, is what Germany has done and continues to do, which is to restitute 1,100 Benin objects. In the process, they have established a good relations with authorities in Nigeria and in Edo Kingdom that allows for meaningful research and exchange.
Okay,
now,
let me just because of time, Chika, I got to jump in because of time. Just very quickly, Dominic, in 15 seconds, the idea of compensation for these objects, are you a yes or a no?
It's context specific.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. Now's the time to bring this home with closing remarks. We're going to have each of you take a very, very short statement to sum up your argument. The team arguing yes is first. Which of the two of you would like to go first?
Chika, would you like to go ahead?
Sure.
Okay.
So imagine someone who inherited a classic car that she hoped to leave for her children. Then a wealthy neighbor comes along, seizes the car, parks it in his fancy garage. When the owner demanded the car back, the owner responds with a shrug, build a more deserving garage for the car so everyone in town can admire it. Meanwhile, the wealthy neighbor's garage is electric fenced to keep his distraught neighbor away from seeing the seized car. But he still says with a straight face, hey, you can see your car wherever you want it and whenever you want. Not only that, the wealthy man, to fend off the pesky car owner and her children, passes laws to legitimize the seizure because he can. So the question is, should the British Museum, the Musée Quai Branly, the Met, and others like them, so-called universal museums, return the significant looted and detained artifacts in their vaults to their original owners? I think we should all agree that the answer is a resounding yes.
Thank you. Now to the other side. Who would like to go first? Dominic or Mario?
Please.
Great, I'll go first. Thanks so much. I don't know if any of you have been to the Natural History Museum in London, but there's a life-size model of a blue whale. And I went last year to take some photos. There was a boy, maybe 8 years old, and he was just dumbfounded. He simply couldn't believe his eyes. He was astonished that he shares the planet with something so extraordinary. And that's what museums do. You can see a dozen pictures of a whale in a book or on a screen, with a scale telling you it's 90 feet long, that's 2 Greyhound buses, but you don't process the size until you see it. And museums are where we get to process the extraordinary things we share the planet with, and that includes all human ingenuity and creativity down the ages. If we can't go and see the whale, or Stone Age tools, or a mummified Egyptian crocodile, or a Roman mosaic, or Viking ship burials, or a medieval astrolabe from Tehran, or all the other wonders of the past, then how do we bring the world together? Museums are a metaphor for how the present sees the past. Don't let that be a past in which each country only looks to itself and rejects the wonders of the human race. We have far more in common than the things which divide us. Museums are the only places where we can truly process those realities and be as dumbstruck as the boy with the whale. Let museums remain windows onto the world, not mere mirrors of our own societies.
Thank you, Leila. You are up next.
I love museums, but we cannot rely on the passage of time or past normative values to justify ownership. Repatriations are not a zero-sum game. Rather, they're an opportunity for everyone to benefit. When museums treat cultural heritage with respect, they build relationship and develop cultural exchange that benefits visitors, scholars, and future generations. What's more, repatriation is not about liberal guilt, but rather repatriations are celebratory homecomings, breathing new life and meaning into objects that were unlawfully or unethically removed from their contexts. They serve to heal a community while also enforcing values, demonstrating that all nations and all people should be treated with respect for their contributions to culture and history. We are not advocating for the removal and the return of all artifacts, but museums do have the ability to right some of the wrongs of our past through equitable treatment of cultural heritage. Access to cultural heritage is a human right. It's protected by international law because heritage wields incredible value. Art has the ability to heal, unify, and inspire. As such, centuries of international laws and legal conventions have been developed to protect heritage, provide people with access to their culture, and to contribute to our shared human story.
Thank you. And Mario, you get the last word arguing against repatriation.
As we conclude this debate, I want you to look past the comforting fiction offered to us by the side opposite. They want you to believe that we can magically undo the brutal realities of the 19th century simply by putting objects on planes, and that everything that is claimed was actually stolen, which I don't buy. If you take nothing else away from this debate, consider these 3 points. First, if museums truly are the crime scenes of history the side opposites say they are, then the absolute worst thing you can do is to hide the evidence. Returning these objects doesn't unburn ancient cities, it just makes us lie about our own past. If you think there was a crime, you do not serve the victims of history by wiping the crime scene clean. No, you keep everything exactly as it is, document and explain. Second, shipping a ritual object back to Africa just to lock it inside a modern climate-controlled vitrine is not decolonization. It's actually the final victory of westernization. It forces traditional African heritage into the straitjacket of Western property laws and museum culture. Finally, we are being asked to alter history to soothe the modern conscience. But the museum's duty is to truth, not therapy. We must refuse the demand to empty a restitution just to make ourselves feel a little bit better.
Thank you, Mario. And that is a wrap on our debate about returning artifacts from museums to the countries of origin. I want to thank you all, Chika, Leila, Dominic, and Mario, for the way you did this debate. You really shed light. You were interesting throughout, and you were also so fair-minded in the way you addressed one another, which is a goal of ours to show that we can disagree without being nasty or rude about it. You were all very respectful, and we learned a lot from listening to you. So to all of you, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank the questioners who came, Elizabeth Marlowe and Graham Bowley, for the questions they brought in and really got us to some interesting places as well. And finally, a big thank you to you, our audience, for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. As a nonprofit working to combat extreme polarization through what you just saw, civil debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you, by the Rosencrantz Foundation, and by supporters of Open to Debate. Our chairman is Robert Rosencrantz. Our CEO is Leah Mathau. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is senior advisor to the CEO. Andrew Lipson is head of production. Michelle Debrasini is head of marketing. This episode was produced by Julia Sirkin and Alexis Pangrazi. Scott Jacoby provided production support. The team also includes Gabrielle Iannicelli, Linda Lee, Gabriella Mayer, and Katy Perry. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement. I'm John Donvan. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.